Hello and welcome to A Novel Idea, the show where we interview authors. And today, well, I am your host, Noelle Boc. I usually say that first. And today we are here with Eric J. Dolin, who just has a book about to come out,
Yes.
not quite out yet, called Left for Dead. So welcome to the show, Eric.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, you are very welcome. So, I did read the book, as I said.
Good.
I always
That doesn't
read the
always
books
happen
first.
with interviews.
I find that I didn't
Yes.
realize that was a thing, but I would never not read the book. So, it's about a very completely unknown, I had never heard of this incident before. So where did you find out about this incident? And tell us just like a little bit about it.
Right. Yeah, trying to figure out what you're going to write about is extremely difficult because you've got to come up with a topic that excites you, your agent, a publisher, but most of all would get readers interested. So oftentimes when I write a book, this is my 16th book, oftentimes when I'm writing a book, I come up with another idea while writing the book. But for this, I looked at a book that was written in the 1970s, which was a compilation of shipwrecks and disasters from the late 1500s to the mid 1800s. And for each disaster, it had a paragraph description. So when I read this description of this guy, this American sealing captain, Charles H. Barnard, being marooned in the Falkland Islands for 18 months along with 4 other individuals, that got my attention. Excuse me. And right beneath the paragraph on Charles Barnard, it referenced a book that he wrote in 1829 about his experience. So I immediately read that book, and then I started reading other contemporary accounts, newspaper accounts, and there was actually a legal case that came out of this. So I finally decided that there was enough information to tell this exciting, true story of this wild, fateful encounter between an American sealing vessel, a shipwrecked British brig coming from Australia, and a British warship that meet in the Falkland Islands during the War of 1812. There's a lot of misunderstanding and mistrust in this incident, and it basically, the centerpiece is it results in these 5 men, Charles Barnard, the captain of the sealer, 1 other American crewman, and 3 British sailors being intentionally marooned on the Falkland Islands for 18 months. But it's far more than that. That's sort of the core. If that didn't happen, I probably wouldn't have written the book. However, there's a lot of intrigue and treachery that revolves around that, and it involves the war, the taking of a wartime prize. It involves the fact that the Americans extended a humanitarian gesture to these 54 British individuals who were shipwrecked on the Falklands and offered to save them. But in the intervening weeks and months that they were putting that plan into effect, a British warship shows up. And that British warship turns the tables on the Americans, and despite their humanitarian gesture, they decide to make the American ship a prize of war and all of the Americans prisoners of war. And that's a horrible turn of events, but even worse is for these 5 men who are sort of sacrificial lambs in this whole process getting left behind. And they do survive. And the story of their survival is just absolutely amazing. So when I read all these different aspects of the story, I knew that it would make a really exciting book, and a book that I wanted to write, and incidentally quite different from a lot of my prior books. A lot of my prior books basically cover, decades of time or centuries. And I specifically set out with the idea of wanting to write a book that focused on one set of characters that I could follow all the way through the book, that only lasted for a few years, and involved some kind of maritime disaster. So luckily, in reading that book from the 1980s and finding that account, I got the book that I wanted to write, and I hope it's a book that people want to read.
I really, really liked it a lot, and I was just sharing with you before that I like a good maritime venture on the high seas kind of story. Yeah. Anyway, so it was definitely up my alley to read it. So one of the pieces I thought was really also just interesting is how much there is about the sealing industry in there. And I guess I knew about it. It wasn't something I didn't know about. But I was really intrigued throughout by all of the descriptions you had of like the sealing and how you actually deal with the skins and all of those pieces after. Was that like a really surprising part for you to like try to work through all the stuff around sealing?
That was the only part of the book that wasn't a surprise, because I wrote a book many years ago called Leviathan, The History of Whaling in America. And oftentimes whaling ventures from the United States engaged in sealing as well. So I knew a little bit about it from them, but then I wrote a book called Fur, Fortune, and Empire, which is about the history of the fur trade in America. And sealing is a big part of the fur trade in America. The trade of seal pelts over to Canton, China in the late 1700s and early 1800s, which this is a part, was a thriving industry. And in Fur, Fortune, and Empire, I have a whole chapter on sealing. So that's the only part of this book that I had good background in. But it was critical, because that's the reason that the American sealing vessel is down in the Falklands at this time. It is to follow the well-worn trail of merchants who would go to the Falklands, go to other islands in the Atlantic, some in the Indian Ocean, and even the Pacific Ocean, and they would slaughter seals. They'd strip them of their skins. They'd get all the flesh off the skins. They'd peg them out on the ground so they're taut, dry them for a few days, and then they'd be as dry as boards. Then they'd throw them in the hold of their ship, and they'd sail all the way to Canton, China, which is now Guangzhou, China, where they could be sold from anywhere from as little as 35 cents a pelt up to $5 a pelt. And that doesn't sound like much, although $5 in the early 1800s was a considerable amount. But when you consider that American sealers, as well as sealers from other countries, many other countries engaged in this, killed probably on the order of 2.5 to 3.5 million seals during this short period of time. It was a big industry that employed literally hundreds of ships and thousands of men. And I have an author's note, as you know, in the beginning of the book, because I know a lot of people are squeamish about sealing, because there's still a couple of countries that seal today. But I make the point that the United States is not one of them. And I'm looking at this purely as something that was taking place in the early 1800s, a time when sealing was a respected industry. There was no conservation movement. There were no environmentalists. So if you're squeamish about these accounts of seals being clubbed on the head and then stripped of their pelts, and also sea elephants being killed to take their blubber and boil it down to become illuminating oil, sort of like spermaceti oil from a sperm whale, I apologize in advance, but this is history. You've got to put it in perspective, and it's an integral part of the story, even though at times it might be difficult to read.
Yeah, and it is, like, because if you start thinking about it, and even now, so when we get into the Falklands, and I don't actually remember off the top of my head, how many islands are there in the Falklands? Do you remember?
The Falklands are like these geological crumbs that were left in the Atlantic Ocean when the continents spread apart. There are about 700 islands, but if you count only the islands that are visible at high tide, it's probably about 200 islands. But still, it's a very broken up landscape. It's a very dangerous place to navigate. So it's not at all surprising that this British ship wrecked. But the real reason the British ship wrecked, as you know, is because the captain was totally incompetent, drunk, and he was basically in his cabin sleeping with one of the former prostitute convicts from Australia who he had shacked up with, instead of steering the ship during a time of potential danger. So all of these different characters that involved, and the 54 people on the ship that wrecked, they came from Australia, the convict colony in Australia, and 10 of them were former convicts, 4 of them were former prostitutes. There were also Royal Marines, and you couldn't ask for a more colorful and, in a few cases, disreputable set of characters to be marooned on the Falkland Islands and then potentially be rescued by these Americans.
Yeah, it was a very interesting cast of people, for sure. And even just one of the other things I thought was really interesting was the initial American boat leaving to go sealing.
Right.
And they had all of these captains board, which
Right.
was strange to,
Oh,
to
yeah.
say the least.
Yeah.
And even, I know you kind of tried to explain it, but it still didn't make any sense to me. I'm like, why would you go with this? You know, a group
Right.
of 4 people.
Well, what happened is, it was right on the eve of the War of 1812, and they decided to set off in this sailing adventure knowing that the war might break out at any time. And because of the lead up to the war and so many British ships taking Americans through impressment and basically stealing American sealers off of American ships, a lot of American ships were in the harbor. They weren't out doing their job, essentially. So there were a lot of unemployed mariners. So he was able to corral 5, a total, including himself. There were 5 former sealing captains. And as anybody who knows about maritime history in the early 1800s in particular, when you were a captain of a ship, a merchant ship or a military ship, you were the absolute leader. Right. You had all of the control, and you must be obeyed. So imagine having 5 former captains having to follow the tune of one captain who was a rather distressing and volatile individual to begin with, and you're almost asking for some kind of trouble.
Yeah, for sure. I was probably, well, wasn't luck, I guess, but when Charles gets stranded,
right.
marooned
Right.
on purpose on the island, it's lucky, I guess, that there were no other captains with him.
Right.
Like, I can't even imagine,
Right.
like, if there were, like, all of them buying. And as it was, like, they had trouble as
right.
it was.
One of the guys that he was stranded with was a miserable bully of a man who caused a lot of problems.
Yes, and I was shocked. All of these events even happening. Like, sometimes I'll think about that, like, just the odds of all of these things happening together, right? Like, just seem impossible.
Right.
And then they happen.
I couldn't agree.
And so you could see, okay, all of this going on, but then that the other 4 decide to maroon Charles by himself,
Right.
and even take the dog.
Right.
That was just completely shocking to me at the time too. I was like, wait a minute, they're leaving him
Right.
completely alone, and they took stuff, like everything, with them.
Yeah.
And it's a real testament, like that. I mean, if you want to read this book, everybody, which you should, because it was great, but like, just how he survived and managed to figure all of that out, by himself for the period of time that he was alone. I mean, he was alone for quite a while.
Right.
On his own, and to be able to really, like, I think about that, like, would I have been able to figure out how to, like, survive that long by myself with very little left to me?
But he had some experience in the Falklands, and he
Right,
was
yes.
a very resourceful kind of guy. But yeah, him becoming his own sort of Robinson Crusoe for those many months was an interesting part of the story. But one thing you said that is fascinating to me, and that seems to come up with almost every book I've written, and I'm sure every book that anybody else has ever written about history, is that if certain things didn't happen at certain times, the story would have been so different. For example, if they hadn't marooned those 5 men, and that wasn't part of the story, I probably wouldn't have written the book, because it wouldn't have been as compelling. And if just a few people had made different decisions each point of the way, it could have ended quite differently. And that's the case with almost any event like this. It's even the case, I wrote a book recently called Rebels at Sea about privateering in the American Revolution. And what that really drove home to me is that there were so many decisions made during that war. If they had been made slightly differently, or if one general had acted in a slightly different manner, hadn't given up so quickly, hadn't retreated, had attacked, the war could have ended rather differently. And in this situation on the Falklands, there were so many things that if people had to do them over again, maybe they would have done differently, especially how their peers reacted to what they did once they came back to the mainland. And I'm sure if any of them could look down from wherever they are today and see this book coming out, they probably want to create a new history, because some of these people don't come off too well.
Right. Yeah, that's true. That's true. And I didn't know if, obviously you read the book that Charles wrote himself.
Yes.
Were there other surviving, like, whatever, the logbook that he actually kept himself, was that, are there surviving pieces of that you know about?
No, I'm not aware. He kept a logbook on basically treated calf, young seal skin, and he used goose quills and probably soot in some form of ink to keep track of what happened during his 534 days of being abandoned with these men. And also, after he got back, he wrote down some notes, but where those are, those original pieces of information, I don't know. Fortunately, he put them down into this book. But the thing that you mentioned, it's important. He is the only account of the 5 men staying on there. A lot of the stuff that happens before that, which is the bulk of the book probably, almost half the book, there's a lot of different perspectives, different accounts. But we do have to rely on Charles Barnard. But there's no reason to think, at least in my mind, that he was being disingenuous in what he reported. And in the end, it's what we had, and nobody contradicted it after his book came out. And it all seems to fit in with what was happening prior to them being abandoned as well.
Now, have you been to the Falklands?
No, that's a sore spot. I always used to say, I wrote a book about whaling. I've never harpooned a whale. I wrote a book about the fur trade. I've never killed a beaver. I wrote a book about China. I've never been to China. People I worked with on this book with, there are people in the Falklands who helped me with information, and they said, you've got to come down and visit. I said, it's really expensive, and I don't think I need to visit to tell the story. In fact, one of the blurbers grew up on New Island, Menson Bound, the guy who found the Endurance this past summer, Shackleton's vessel. He grew up on New Island where much of the action took place, and he read the book, and he said that I captured the Falklands as a character perfectly. I would have loved to have visited if I had unlimited resources, but what I told the people on the Falklands, and your viewers can help out with this, I said if the book does really well and sells a huge amount of copies, I will have enough money and I will go to the Falklands and I will deliver a copy of the book to anybody who wants it there. So if the book does well enough, I can justify a trip to the Falklands, because it's quite a long trip and it is fairly expensive. Yeah,
I'm sure. And you have like a lot of photographs, which is really nice.
From photographer Georgina Strange. She's wonderful. She grew up on New Island.
Oh.
And her father was instrumental in making New Island a preservation area. So she's a photographer, and I'm so happy that I got in touch with her.
I didn't look it up. There's like a little museum.
Yes,
right
little
there.
Barnard, Charles H. Barnard Museum. It's not the original building that he built, the original hut, but it's sort of a recreation of a more substantial hut, and they have artifacts in there. So if you're ever lucky enough to go to the Falklands and go to New Island, make sure you stop by the Charles H. Barnard Museum, and let me know if they don't have a copy of my book on display, which they should.
They definitely should, for sure. And I thought that was fascinating that they even have a little museum, to this person who, as you're pointing out, until I read your book, I've never heard of this person. These people are like lost to history until your book just brought them back into the limelight.
I obviously have never heard of it. I don't think I think you can count on one hand the number of historians alive today who, before this book came out, knew of the story, unless they're from the Falklands. There's still a lot of stories like that out there. Whether all of them are book-worthy is questionable, but there still are a lot of, you consider how many thousands of ships went out, how many thousands of individual stories there are, and people love reading about the age of sail, and if you're lucky enough to find a story that's intriguing and compelling, it can make for a good book and give somebody some entertainment, and also, without too much pain, learn something about the era and the context and the War of 1812 and what the Falklands are like. The way that I look at all my books is they basically are on a specific topic, but they use that topic to tell a broader story of American history at that time.
I really enjoyed that perspective about the War of 1812. Like, I would never have thought about, something like, well, we got to get out. We got to get out, like, to go do our trip because, this war is coming, and, we want to try to beat the people coming out and after us and trying to impress sailors and all that good stuff. Well, not good stuff. That wasn't a good stuff thing.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to take a quick break so that you can read to us a little bit from your book.
Great.
And then we'll talk a little bit after that.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks.
Great.
This reading is from the very beginning of the book, and I think it gives you a good context for understanding it. Charles H. Barnard, captain of the American sealing brig Nanina, had only the best of intentions. His aim was to ensure the survival of the people under his care. On June 11, 1813, Barnard and 4 other volunteers disembarked the anchored Nanina, climbed into a small boat, and sailed about 10 miles from New Island to Beaver Island, both part of the Falkland Islands archipelago in the South Atlantic. armed with knives, clubs, lances, and guns, and with the assistance of Barnard's trusty dog, Scent, the 5 men planned to kill birds and hogs and take them back to the Americans and British, who remained on the Nanina and were fast running out of fresh provisions. It was a mission of mercy. The hunt went well, and within a few days the boat was filled to the gunwales with bloody carcasses of slain animals. But when the men sailed back to New Ireland late on June 14th, they were greeted with an alarming sight. The Nanina was gone. Stunned, confused, and angry, the men hauled the boat up onto the beach and, according to Barnard, awaited the approach of daylight in the most impatient and tormenting anxiety. Sleeping fitfully in the cold night air, they hoped that in the morning light they would find a letter telling them why the Nanina had left and when it was coming back. A frantic search at dawn turned up nothing, no note, either in a bottle or hung conspicuously from a piece of wood or a boulder. They saw only sand, rocks, scrubby vegetation, and birds in the distance, walking on the beach or flying overhead. Refusing to believe that he and the other 4 men had been barbarously deserted, Barnard seized on another explanation. The Nanina and her crew must have headed to Beaver Island to pick them up, but they had gone to the opposite side from where the men were hunting, thus missing their comrades. Convinced by Barnard's reasoning, the men's hopes were rekindled. They dragged the boat into the water and sailed off once again. This time they entered the main harbor on the eastern side of Beaver Island. Upon entering the harbor, as Barnard later recalled, they experienced the almost unsupportable anguish of neither finding the brig nor discovering any trace that she had been there. They had been cruelly abandoned at the beginning of a Falklands winter, with little to sustain them, and no explanation why they had been left in such a horrendous predicament. The events leading up to this abandonment and what happened afterward produce a story with so many unlikely threads and a cast including such exceptionally colorful characters that one might think that it sprang from the pen of a fiction writer with an overactive imagination. And yet the story is true. It is a tale involving a shipwreck, British and Americans meeting under the most stressful circumstances in a time of war, kindness and compassion, drunkenness, the birth of a child, treachery, greed, lying, a hostile takeover, stellar leadership, ingenuity, severe privation, the great value of a good dog, perseverance, endurance, threats, bullying, banishment, a perilous 1,000-mile open ocean journey in a 17.5-foot boat, an improbable rescue mission in a rickety ship, and legal battles over a dubious and disgraceful wartime prize. And it all started with 2 ships, one American, the other British, sailing to the Falklands from different directions. I'm out of breath reading that.
I was reading that description. I'm like, it really is like, reading that, it seems completely impossible that this story would have even come together. And one of the other things I really marveled about, and I know, like Barnard wrote his book, just the detail, the level of detail that he really was able to keep track of, considering that he was like marooned, on and writing on sealskin, basically like all these days. Like, it's really fantastic. Did we know what kind of dog Scent is?
No, we don't. I wish we did.
I wish we did too.
He couldn't have been a very small dog. He had to be a fairly substantial dog, because during the course of this book, not only does he chase down and help kill very powerful hogs who live on the Falkland Islands with massive tusks, he was gored in the groin. He had an eye poked out with one of the tusks. So he had to be a pretty tough, scrappy dog. I don't know what kind of dog. I wish I did. Anybody who has a dog knows how important they are with respect to companionship. But not only was Scent an important companion, he was critical to the success of these men being able to survive those 534 days. It was just an absolutely amazing story.
Yeah, I was always picturing him as kind of like a brindled, mastiffy
Yeah.
kind of dog. I'm like, he must be that kind of dog in there. I interrupted you. You were going to say something before. Do you remember what it was when I
No,
brought in the
one of the
dog?
consequences of getting older is if you start to go off on tangents, you forget where you were going. So I actually totally forgot. I gave a talk a little while ago. It wasn't on this book, at the New York Historical Society. I'm on stage with like 100 people or more in the audience, and I'm being filmed, and I was answering a question, and in the middle of the question, my mind went to a different thing. I veered towards that, and then I came back and I said, I have no idea what I was saying before. Can you cue me up again? So I don't know. I didn't even start it, so we don't know what I said.
All right. Well, that's fine. That's fine. Are you working on something new now?
Yes. Believe it or not, I'm working on another shipwreck book, but this one is a little more deadly. It's in the 1830s. It's in the Pacific Ocean. It involves an American whale ship. And the most amazing coincidence, which had nothing to do with me picking the topic, because I only discovered this after I found this unknown story, is that the captain of this ship is also named Barnard. But he's not, as far as I know, they're not related. They're probably distantly related because they both sort of hail back to Nantucket, but there's no close relation that I was aware of. So I find that, I don't know, it's either a serendipitous coincidence or it's very strange. I don't know which one.
How did you come upon this second story there, or the other story you're working on?
I read about this a little bit while I was working my whaling book well over a decade ago, almost 15 years ago. I had forgotten about it. I put aside couple of newspaper articles about it at the time, and then I just was looking around for an idea, and I remembered it, and there were a lot of good documents to use, especially contemporary newspaper accounts, but it's really a story about clash of cultures. It has a lot about tattooing in it.
Ooh.
Because the Americans that survived, some of them were forcibly tattooed. This is in a Micronesian island where this took place, not far from New Zealand or in Australia. But so it's a story about a clash of cultures, some murders by starvation, murders by shipwreck, American military might, because it was one of our first naval expeditions, was sent out to try to rescue some of these men who are on this island. So it's got a little bit of everything. It's just a fascinating story, very different from this story, other than the fact that they're both maritime tales.
All right, sounds great.
Yeah.
Now, I must ask you, do you have a library card?
Yes, of course. The Abbott Public Library, my hometown library in Marblehead.
I know.
I have a library card.
Going in a renovation right now,
yes,
too, right?
Renovation. And I've been to your lovely library a number of times. I've given a couple of talks there, and I've used it to take out books through interlibrary loan. And I've driven over, and I've sat in your library for hours on end and read books.
All right. Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming. This is very wonderful to have you. It was a great book.
Thanks.
It was a great book, everybody. You should read it. So you can find this. You will be able to find this at your local library.
Yes.
Or go to the bookstores and buy lots so that Eric can finally go to the Falklands.
Yes.
Well, thank you again for joining us today. And thank you all for joining us at A Novel Idea. Tune in next time. And again, I am your host, Noelle Boc. See you again soon.